Father, we thank you for what a joy and a privilege it is to be in your house this morning and to learn from your word and to worship together, to fellowship, to encourage one another. And I pray that this is a time that we come together edifying and building each other up, but bringing honor and glory to you and helping each other to be equipped and strengthened with what we need from your word to be able to live faithfully for you each and every day of our week. I pray that our relationships as we come together on Sunday is an extension of what's going on through our lives in the midst of the week, and that we're taking time to encourage each other regularly, daily, praying for one another, caring for each other. We know there are many, many needs within the body of Christ, and I pray that as we minister to each one, that we are being for each other the hands, the feet of grace, of love of God, that you would shine through us into the lives around us. And I pray that that is true this morning. As we come this morning to this place, it is a great, sweet time of fellowship and encouragement of worship that we'll be able to bring honor and glory to your name. And pray as we turn our hearts to the book of Judges again, as we look continually at the life of Samson and what we can learn from it, what we're learning from this book in its entirety as we consider the whole of it. I pray that what we gain from this understanding will help us to honor you and to love you and to trust you and to love you more deeply and to walk more faithfully for you, with you. I pray that it would help us in our pursuit of growing together to become more like Jesus for the glory of God, that we would hear the words of God, that we would allow it to take root in our hearts, and that we give all that we have to pursuing a love relationship with you so that we can become like you and have our lives have an impact for the gospel. So guide my words as I speak. Help me to clearly and articulately explain the word of God so that we can learn from it. Give us each hearts that are receptive to your word, that as we hear it, it'll impact us and change our lives for the glory of God. We pray this in your name. Amen. It was Robert A. Lee who said, "If we abide by the principles taught in the Bible, our country will go on prospering and to prosper. But if we and our posterity ignore its instructions and authority, no man can tell how sudden a catastrophe may overwhelm us and bury all our glory in profound obscurity." Robert A. Lee, one of our founding fathers, one of the men who were instrumental in the early days of our country, understood the issue of authority. He says, if we as a nation continue to place ourselves under the authority of God and His Word, then God will continue to bless. Which may or may not always be true, right? God can bless even when we're under authority, but that blessing may not always come the way we think. But the point is he makes the point that authority is important. That we all fall under authority, that we all fall under some sort of authority structure that then dictates for us what our lives must be like. The problem that we're seeing with the book of Judges is that they no longer recognize that authority, right? We're told at the very beginning of this book that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel in these days. They were simply judges, and the people did what was right in their own eyes. And I believe that what we're seeing in the course of this book, what we're seeing exemplified right now in Samson's life, is a people who don't submit to any authority but their own. And I believe that one of the lessons that we need to take out of this book is this, that when we do what is right in our own eyes, the only authority we recognize and the only interest that we pursue will be our own. We need to come to a place as we study this book and as we live our life before God that we recognize you and I are people under authority. We don't have the right to do whatever we want, what's right in our own eyes. And when we do that, we become our own authority. We pursue our own interests. And I would say 10 times out of 10, we make a royal mess out of everything. We need to submit ourselves to God's authority. As we look at Judges chapter 15, we're going to see the Philistines' deceit and their ultimate defeat. Well, not ultimate, because they still persist after this. But we see their deceit and a defeat here at the hands of Samson. And God's plan to punish the Philistines continues to come to fruition. But let's read Judges chapter 15. I want to get the entirety of the text, see what's going on here, and then we'll kind of take it apart little by little and try to understand what's happening. So Judges chapter 15, follow along as I read, beginning in verse 1. Now after some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat. And he said, I will go into my wife in the chamber. But her father would not permit him, or would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches. And when he had turned them tail to tail, put a torch between each pair of tails, and when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and set fire to the stacked grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, who has done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit. And he struck them hip and thigh with a great blow, and went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock at Etam. Then the Philistines came and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? And they said, we've come to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock at Etam, and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so have I done to them. And they said to him, we have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. They said to him, no, we will not. We will only bind you and will give you into their hands. We will surely not kill you. So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. Now when he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath Lehi. He was very thirsty, and called upon the Lord, and said, you have granted this salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst, and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. And when he had drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore, the name of this place is called En-Hakkore. It is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So once again, we see this story of Samson in the context of this book of people doing what is right in their own eyes. So far, we've seen a man seemingly consumed and led by his own passions, his own lusts, his own desires, his own desire for anger and vengeance. Now, he's a man of faith, according to Hebrews. And we'll pinpoint, I think, a few locations where maybe that comes out. And of course, we don't have all of Samson's life for us recorded, right? We have a few glimpses of his life. There may be much more things that we don't have insight into, but as we consider this, what we're seeing here is God is using Samson in spite of himself. He's not a man wholly devoted to God. He's a man that's pursuing and following after his own passions and lusts. And what we see happening here is, first off in this text, that Samson is slighted. Samson is slighted. Now after some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to his wife with a young goat, and he said, I will go into her chamber, but the father would not let her go in, or let him go in. And the father said, I really thought you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Take her. And Samson said, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. So Samson caught 300 foxes, tied their tails together, put a torch of fire in it, and set them loose to go into the fields of grain, the stacked grain, and the olive orchards. Verse 6, when they discovered what he had done, they said, it was Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, who has done this because he gave his wife to his companion. So they went and burned both her and her father with fire, and Samson swears vengeance upon them. This is the story of what we have happening so far. If you recall from last week, Samson went down to the Philistine village, saw this Timnite woman, said it's right in my own eyes, demands his parents, hand this girl over to him, get me for her as my wife. They say, isn't there someone among our own people? Israel law forbade intermarriage with these pagan peoples. That didn't seem to matter to Samson. His own parents said, no, this probably isn't a good idea. He didn't seem to mind that either. And so parents finally concede. They go down. They arrange this marriage. And in that context, when he's separated from his parents in there, we have the first experience where the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him and he kills a lion with nothing but his bare hands. Coming in contact with a dead body, destroying his Nazirite vow. He should have made amends for that at the temple and restored that vow before the Lord. That didn't seem to matter to him either. This wedding feast, he goes down to the feast. He makes a wager. He lost like a good game. And so he tells them this riddle based upon his experience with the lion. Says, if you can solve it within the 7 days of this wedding feast, then I will give you 30 linen clothes and 30 garments. And if not, then you have to do the same for me. By day 3, they're like racking their brains out. They can't figure it out. And now they're starting to panic because now they have to pay this debt if they can't figure it out. And so they not just try to entice the wife to get the answer, they downright threaten her with fire. We will burn you and your family down if you do not find out the answer and tell it to us. This wife, no name given to us, has a stronger devotion to her own people than to her new husband and tries to beg and plead with him, imploring him, nagging and badgering to the point that finally, on day 7, just before sundown, he gives in and tells her the answer to the riddle. She then translates that to her people. They come to him and say, here's the answer, and he is angry, right? If you hadn't, he says in the text, if you hadn't plowed with my heifer, if you hadn't enticed my wife, if you had not badgered her or threatened her, you would not have found the answer to this. But he decides to keep his part of the bargain anyway. And God is using this, despite his sinful anger. He goes down to Ashkelon, kills 30 men, takes their clothes, brings it up, pays the debt, and storms home to his father's house in anger. That was the context of where we left off. Then it says to us that after some weeks, after some days, we're not really sure how long this is, but some commentators think this could have been weeks. He goes home, leaving his newfound wife in her father's home, apparently not having consummated their marriage, not having made it. They called them husband and wife, but it wasn't apparently truly official yet because he was able to take that wife and give it to his best man. He didn't take time for his wife. He didn't take her home with him, which if you stop and consider about it, that's not a real strong statement about his character, is it? He ups and leaves, but then decides some weeks later he's going to come back. Apparently he's cooled down enough. Comes back with a young goat, maybe a customary gift, kind of a peace offering. Wants to go in to see his wife, and the father says, absolutely not. I gave her away to your best man. But, trying to appease him now. Look, her younger sister, isn't she more pretty? Take her instead. Samson doesn't want anything to do with that. Samson's anger is roused once again. And he says that's not going to happen. In fact, he says, this time, he says in verse 3, I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm. Samson is now at a place where he has been slighted by this behavior. Not just once, but now this is the second time, right? The first time, he was cheated because they badgered his wife. She got the answer out of him because he wasn't strong enough to say no. He has to pay this debt, so he slaughters 30 people to do so. Now he comes back to find out his wife is not his wife anymore. And so Samson's anger is roused once again, and this time he declares that he will be innocent of their blood when he does them harm. So not only now has Samson allowing once again his anger to be roused, and he's allowing his anger to fuel his actions, but now he's in the justification game. He says, now you have wronged me, so now I'm going to be right when I wrong you back. This is what they call the justification game. When we do what is right in our own eyes, the only authority we recognize will be our own. The only interest we pursue will be our own. Samson's now playing this game, and he's justifying and rationalizing what's going to be his actions now against these people because he's been wronged, right? Has he been legitimately wronged? Probably sure, he has been. But now Samson comes back and says, now, when I have been wronged, you owe me something, and I'm going to repay that debt to you. I'm going to wrong you. And frankly, I'm right in doing so. It's kind of the expression, they had it coming. You ever heard someone say that? Well, they had it coming. In fact, I just heard, in the context of a conversation with a believer this week, that phrase kind of thrown at me. They were talking about having to talk to some customer service people online. Well, they had it coming because their service is terrible. Justification game. They did me wrong. They haven't fulfilled what they're supposed to do, so they had it coming. This is what Samson's beginning to do. I am going to be justified in causing harm to them because you have caused harm to me. How often do we do the same thing, though, isn't it? How many times, maybe we don't say those words in the exact way, but how many times do we play the justification game to try and find an excuse for our sinful actions? Well, if they hadn't so-and-so. Well, if he hadn't yelled at me, I wouldn't have lost my temper. Right? Well, if they hadn't been cranky or burned my food, or if they hadn't been so slow in the road, if they hadn't been late, and we try to justify and rationalize, right? And we try to excuse our sinful behavior because somebody else wronged us in some way, and so therefore they had it coming. Friends, that's not a godly attitude, is it? That's not the attitude that Christ exemplified for us. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he was threatened, he did continue to entrust himself to him who judges justly. We have to be careful to understand when we take things into our own hands and when we do what's right in our own eyes, we have essentially made ourselves our own authority and we no longer recognize God's. And then we can justify anything under the sun. And the only interest that we will pursue are our own. Samson's playing that game. But once again, God uses Samson's anger to accomplish his will. And so he grabs 300 foxes, this is like animal abuse. I'm sure these animals did not survive this experience. But he grabs 300 foxes. Now, when we think of foxes, we think of this little critter thing here, right? This little red-furred animal. In fact, I just saw one in the backyard the other day, run trotting through. Every once in a while, they'll go running through the cemetery. I know they're more afraid of us than I am of them, I think. But we see them all around the place, right? This is what we think of when we think of a fox. However, probably in this region of the world during this time, we have what would be a cousin to that, which is this jackal. We believe that the jackal is more likely the kind of fox animal-related animal that was probably what Samson captured and used, which you can tell very clearly there's a very clear family relationship there, but more, not so red, different colors, a little sleeker. Apparently foxes tend to be a little bit more individualized. Jackals definitely run in hives and groups, easier to capture perhaps, but this is probably the one that Samson was using here. But he would take them, tie their tails together, took a torch of fire, stuck it in there, and set them loose to the grain fields, to the olive orchards, to the stacked grain, the stuff they've already harvested. Now you stop and think about it for a minute, and maybe don't realize this is a devastating blow. I mean, this is not only the food they eat, but this is also probably their livelihood, the things they sell, they use to make a living. And Samson knows this. And this is a devastating blow to the Philistines. So when they discover it, they're not happy. And they look and figure out who it was that did this, and it's told to them it was Samson, the Timnite's son-in-law, because he gave his wife to his best man. Now here's the irony. Why did the wife badger her husband to get the answer to the riddle, to tell the men? To avoid being burnt by fire. You notice what her end of fate was? They come and they burn her and her father with fire. Because they essentially caused all this. If they hadn't given his wife away, Samson wouldn't have come back and got angry, so this is all your fault, so therefore we're going to punish you for it. And so the irony is that they end up receiving the very same thing that they were trying to avoid. But this doesn't make Samson happy. I mean, you might think, you know what, I was wronged, not once but twice with the same family. You might think he'd be going, okay, it serves him right, and just leave it at that. But it's not what happens, is it? In fact, Samson now is even more enraged because they treated his wife and his father-in-law in that fashion. And so he says to them, if you do this, verse 7, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit. And he struck them, verse 8, hip and thigh with great blow. Then he went down and stayed at the cleft of the rock in Etam. So they just kill this woman and her father. Samson swears, I'm going to be avenged by you. And it goes and says he struck them hip and thigh. And all we can figure is that this is a term that indicates a very severe blow. It has the same terminology of when they would make a vow in the Old Testament. They would place their hand under their thigh or their hip as a vow. It's the same kind of a terminology, and it seems to be an indication that this was a very severe blow, a crippling blow. He took, and it doesn't say this like killed them, but he beat them. And he was avenged on them. But then he runs away and hides in the rocks of Etam. If you look on the map here, Zorah is Samson's hometown, if you remember. Timnah is where he met the Timnite woman. Ashkelon down here is where he killed the 30 men. The rock of Etam, where he's hiding now, is over here. So this is Timnah, where all this is happening. Then he runs down to the rock of Etam, where he's there hiding, kind of hanging out, waiting to see what's going to happen, I'm guessing. It's here that Samson is betrayed by his own people. Verse 9. It says, then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? They said, we have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us. Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam and said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? Why then is this that you have done this to us? And he said to them, as they did to me, so I have done to them. And they said to him, we have come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hand of the Philistines. And Samson said to them, swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves. And they said to him, no, we will not only bind you and give you into their hands, we will surely not kill you. And so they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. So here you have Samson hiding at the rock of Etam. The Philistines send a small army to capture him. They come up against Judah, they come up against him. Judah says, why are you here coming up against us? What have we done to you? And they say, it's not you, it's Samson. We're coming to take him to do to him what he's done to us. So then they bring 3,000 men to him and say, what have you done? You can almost read between the lines and say, what have you done, you foolish, stupid person? You've brought the Philistines to our doorstep. Don't you know that there are rulers? You'll find out, as you look at the story of Daniel, they had disarmed the people. They were, at the time of the kings, there was only 2 swords in all of Israel, Saul's and Jonathan's. They were helpless against this, and they're like, what? Don't you know what you've done? And so they said, we're here to bind you and take and hand you over to them. And you have to wonder, why do you need 2 small armies to capture one guy? Remember, right? Well, yes, he's killed 30 men in Ashkelon, right? He's come and he's browbeat these people for murdering his wife and father-in-law. But is that all? We're going to find out a little bit here. This escalates. And of course, the final moment of his life is a pretty significant one. But I'm guessing that Samson had more events in his life than what's possibly recorded here for us. You bring a small army to capture Samson. Your own people bring 3,000 people to arrest you. My guess would be you have a history, right? There's been a lot of things that have been going on that have set the precedent that this man is not going to go easily and it's going to take a small army to get him. And so they come up against him and they say, we're going to bind you and hand you over to him. Now, you have a couple things going on here. You have this eye for eye mentality, right? Samson's already been exhibiting this. They hurt me, so I'm going to hurt them back. I'm going to avenge myself upon you. Now the Philistines are coming and saying, listen, we're going to do to him what he's done to us. And when Samson's explaining himself, he says, I just did to them what they did to me. You have this back and forth act of vengeance, this eye for an eye kind of behavior. On top of that, you've got a people here, Israel, who are willingly handing over one of their own. Well, you can take that one of 2 ways. You can look at that like, what is wrong with these people? They're not even willing to stand up and fight for their own deliverance. Remember, at this point, in this encounter with Samson, the people haven't even cried for deliverance yet, have they? They've been in captivity for 40 years, been oppressed by the Philistines for 40 years, and God steps in to intercede, and they have not yet asked for deliverance. They've gotten resigned to where they're at. And now they're willing to hand over one of their own, rather than say, no, this is an opportunity God's been bringing so that we can bring punishment upon these people and be free from their oppression. They have no faith left in God. The other perspective you look at is this is God's working in all of this, isn't he? God chose Samson from birth to be used to bring punishment to the Philistines and to begin the deliverance process. God doesn't seem to want the people involved yet. God seems to be working in a much different pattern this way. You can look at this one as these people are just so faithless and so far from God that they are willing to hand over one of their own people. Whereas the other side of it is look at God is working in a way that we can't even begin to yet understand. And he certainly does. Whichever way you look at it, God is still using this for a purpose. They bind him, and the text says, with new ropes, meaning they're stronger. They're not the ones that are old, that are already somewhat frayed. These are brand new ropes, and they bring him out. And at this point, Samson destroys. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and put his hand out and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey have I struck down 1,000 men. And as soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath Lehi. So he comes up, they bring him up, they come out shouting, victory, we have him, he's ours! Does it ever work that way with God? God's going to have the last word here, and this is yet another opportunity that God is using Samson to bring punishment upon the Philistines. And as soon as they see this, the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon him, and those bonds flax by fire. That's like brittle. It's like putting paper on your hands. And he breaks free, grabs the fresh jawbone of a donkey, again violating that Nazirite vow because that's contact with a dead body, and slaughters 1,000 men. More dead bodies, right? This place became Ramath Lehi. Imagine this. I mean, the picture I had in my head just a moment ago when I was reading this was the Hulk. Everybody seen the Avengers movies? The Green Hulk just smashing through, slaughtering people. I can't even begin to fathom what this must have been like. God came upon him and used one man to slaughter 1,000, to bring judgment upon a pagan nation of the Philistines. And from there, he throws the bone away, and as soon as he's speaking, he threw the bone away out of his hand. The place was called Ramath Lehi. Now, we don't know where this Lehi is. We've tried to ascertain where all this took place at. No commentators have been able to really pinpoint. They have lots of suggestions of where they think it might be, but nothing that was concrete. But this was the place where it all began to take point. And at the end of this, we see Samson very famished, on the point of what perhaps death, or at least that's his fear. As we read in verse 18, he was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, you have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant, and shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? And God split open the hollow places at Lehi, and water came out from it, and when he had drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. And therefore the name of its place was En-Hakkore. It is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines for 20 years. After all of this, of course, Samson is very understandably a little bit exhausted, tired, worn out. And he's feeling at the point of exhaustion, number one, of very extreme thirst, number two, in fear that he's going to be in this weakened state, they're going to come find him and kill him. And he cries out to God. And I think I had previously stated that nowhere up until the last moment of his life does he call out to God. It wasn't entirely true. He does call out here. But he calls out at a moment of desperation. Now, this is that aspect, I think, where faith is evidenced in his life. I mean, Samson could have very easily said, you know what, I've done this. In fact, his song of victory, when he says, that with this fresh jawbone of a donkey, I slaughtered 1,000 people. Very little reference. Samson has never in this process sought God's direction, sought God's leading. He's been pursuing his own lusts and passions because he is his own authority at this point. He's not seemingly recognized God's. And yet, in this moment of desperation, where does Samson turn? We got to give him credit for that, right? He does turn to God. He recognizes that God gave him the victory. He recognizes that it's God's power coming upon him to accomplish the feats that he's doing. And so we need to give him credit what that is. I believe that's part of that faith that we see in Hebrews 11 that's alluding to. He does come to God. He does turn to him. And he calls out to him in that time of desperation. Even if the motivation is somewhat still selfishly motivated. He says, I am so famished. Are you going to let me die after all of this? Or let them find me and take me and kill me? It's still selfishly motivated, and yet there's still a faith that causes him to call upon God. He defeats these 1,000 men. But then God refreshes him here at this place, and we're told then that he judges Israel during the time of the Philistines for 20 years. This is an incredible story, but what it tells us is this. I believe it's this example of when we do what is right in our own eyes, the only authority we recognize, the only interests we pursue are our own. Consider this. The woman, Samson, did what was right in his own eyes, right? The woman was right to him. He demanded that this woman be given to him as a wife, which means he did not recognize God's authority in his life. God had forbidden this intermarriage. His parents said no. They didn't forbid it, but they tried to dissuade him from it at least, and he didn't even seem to recognize their authority. He had become his own authority, and he did not recognize any other in his life. He was pursuing the lust of the flesh. Granted, he was following a godly nudge in the direction of the Philistines, but I believe if Samson had been a righteous man from birth, God would have used him in incredible ways even still. But God had a purpose for Samson's life. He stubbornly persisted, following his own passions and his own ways, despite what anybody else would say. He wagered this riddle to get personal gain, and when he was cheated out, his anger and his desire for vengeance led him to kill 30 people to accomplish that. He storms off, not fulfilling any responsibility to his new wife, only to come back later, then trying to take responsibility for it. Finding out that she's been given away, he again enacts vengeance upon them and upon the people who then ultimately kill them for their actions. Samson's a man who has been driven by his personal interests. He doesn't recognize any other authority in his life but his own. The Israelites, they did what was right in their own eyes. They didn't ask God's direction, what should we do with this? They just simply said, we're going to save our own skin and we're going to hand this man over. He's more trouble than he's worth. Of course, the Philistines, a pagan nation, they threatened this woman to get the answer to the riddle, and then when they got it, but then when it turned out that ended up being a bad thing, and they ended up killing her anyway. Doing what's right in their own eyes. You see, when the standard for determining what is right and wrong is based upon our own authority, our own standards, our own fleshly desires, we will have no other interest but that we have no interest in submitting ourselves to God's authority. And what I think we need to understand and take away from all of this is this. You and I are under authority. Do you believe that? We don't have the right to do what we want in life. We don't have the right to not be accountable for our actions. We are under God's authority. We don't have the right to do what we want, to do what is right in our own eyes. And yet how many times in our life have we gotten caught up in the justification game? Turn with me to Romans chapter 1 just for a moment. I just want to show you this passage just briefly. Because I think it plays into helping us understand this from a New Testament perspective. Romans chapter 1, verse 18 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools And they exchanged the glory of immortal God for the images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Stop there for a moment. The result of this is that man refused to acknowledge the authority of God. They knew it. Creation reveals it. The evidence is there. God is real. And anybody who tries to deny that is purposely deluding themselves. Why? Because they don't want to answer to God's authority in their life. If God is real and God exists, which He does, that means that God has the right to tell us what is right and wrong because He made us, right? They became futile in their thinking. They rejected the authority of God, instead choosing to do what was right in their own eyes. Verse 24. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another. Men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what they ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. And not only that, they know God's decree that those who practice those things deserve to die. They not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. You see, what happens is this. When we fail to recognize God's rightful place as authoritative in our life, and we instead do what's right in our own eyes, following our own passions and our own lusts, we reject God as authority, we become our own authority, and we walk down a very, very dark path away from God. When they rejected God and His authority in their life, every manner of evil ensued out of it. Is that not the story of Judges? Is that not the story of what we see happening in this terribly dark book about a people who no longer recognize God's authority? They become their own authority, and for them it's whatever I want to do, whatever is right in my own eyes, that is what I will pursue. And so we get to the time of Samson, and God raised up a judge who's anything but righteous. He is listed in Hebrews chapter 11 as a man of faith, and I believe there are moments of faith in his life for sure. But the overall nature and character of his life is not one of godliness, is it? Because he no longer recognized the authority of God in his life. He did what was right in his own eyes. And it took him down a path. It took the entire nation of people down a path away from God. And that's the danger, isn't it? My prayer is, as we consider this text, as we consider this book, as we consider these life lessons, that we would be wary of ever dethroning God in our life. We are not kings to ourselves. We are men and women under authority. And unless we recognize that, we will never be able to be growing together to become more like Jesus for the glory of God. Because we will always pursue a path that's right in our own eyes if we don't recognize God as the right to tell us what path we are to pursue. And so it's my prayer that as we grow together to become more like Jesus for the glory of God, that we will humbly and selflessly submit to His authority every moment of our life, so that we can walk in righteousness and avoid the catastrophe that we see happening in the book of Judges. Father, help us to be men and women who refuse to do what's right in our own eyes, but yet instead trust ourselves to You, to submit ourselves to Your authority. The story of how You use Samson's life is absolutely astounding. What you did through his life, despite his sin, is testament to your glory, not to his. Samson was all about praising his own exploits and his own actions and justifying those decisions, but you still used it for to accomplish your purpose and plan. That tells us about a great God who can use flawed people to accomplish his purpose. But I pray it also teaches us, I would rather be a person who submits myself to your authority, who's not consumed with doing what's right in my own eyes, but that I'm a man who would do what's right in your eyes and to be obedient to you and to follow your commands and to not justify my sinful actions because of whatever circumstance or person is involved in my life, but may I humbly submit myself to your authority. And may I walk in the newness of life. And I pray that you help us as a body to learn that lesson this morning, to submit ourselves to you so that we can grow in greater Christ-likeness to bring honor and glory to your name. We pray this in your name. Amen.